Fantasy sports used to be an informal pastime for fans, but these days it's big business. More than 60 million people play and bet on daily fantasy sports, generating more than $3 billion in entry fees last year, a figure that could reach $14 billion by 2020.
Players generated $250 million in revenue, with more than 90% of it going to fantasy sports giants, DraftKings and FanDuel. For more on how this came to be and how new state regulations are changing the game, we are joined by Andrew Brandt, the director of the Moodrad Center for Sports Law at Villanova University. Good morning, and thanks for being here.
Good morning.
I'm going to ask you the somewhat unanswerable question, which is it the job of the 50 states or is it the job of the federal government to regulate this stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it seems to have fallen to the states. The federal government has had some hearings, but it hasn't risen to the level of legislation. It all started back in 2006 when there was a carve-out for these fantasy sports, but they haven't addressed it federally. So it's state by state. Here in New York, we've had AG Schneiderman shut it down, and that litigation has led to legislation. So it's now being run by the states with a consumer protection angle is the key factor with the state regulation.
How do fantasy sports and traditional sports betting differ?
Fantasy sports is a mashup. It's like you're rooting for these players on this team, this player on that team. You're not rooting for teams. And this is how leagues have held this sort of integrity issue and gambling issue at arm's length, because it's not team-based outcomes, it's player-based outcomes, how they do your little mashup team that you create.
It would seem one of the main criticisms you hear is that our states or the federal government upset because they're not generating revenue. Is that why we're hearing so much talk of licensing fees? Is this to protect us or to protect people making more money at the state level?
Yeah, it depends who you ask. If you ask Attorney General Schneiderman and some of these attorney generals, it's all about consumer protection. We're protecting people from these sharks that submit thousands of cards about fantasy sports every week. If you ask more cynical people, they're saying it's about getting some money, getting some regulation money like they do with other forms of gambling, whether it's lottery, whether it's horse racing. They're bringing fantasy into that loop where they get a cut of it, and it's a revenue generator, obviously.
Many experts believe that it was the advertising blitz early in the NFL season, ironically, that brought regulators' attention on these guys. Does that seem right to you? I mean, was this inevitable that they would get looked at closely?
There was a major blitz this time last year. We're not seeing that now. What it led to was mind share for the two companies we talked about. FanDuel and DraftKings, the mind share way above any other fantasy company. What happened was the heat came. So the heat in terms of legislators and litigation, and there was an insider lawsuit, all those kind of things. Now, responding to the heat, as I said, we've moved from litigation, there was tons of that, to legislation, where now states are regulating this under the guise of either consumer protection and or making some money out of it, getting their piece of this huge fantasy, primarily fantasy football, but fantasy sports pie.
That timeline, though, is so interesting to me because these are still really new companies, and we've seen legislation in a year. I mean, to me, that just seems like people are really paying attention because they are obviously moving the market.
This is startups. I mean, these are startups. These are 3, 4, 5 years old max, and this is taking off. And as I said, even though the heat came last year, these two big companies achieve extraordinary mind share. In some ways, it was diabolically marketed that they get it out there. These are the two names, and everyone's playing. Then the heat came. Then we went from litigation to legislation. Now they're playing again without all the ads, but it's still big, and everybody's playing fantasy sports.
And they're playing right now, too, right? This is the time.
This is the time for all the drafts right now.
Andrew Brandt, thank you.